Hello and welcome back to reaDIYsteaDIY. Well, I'm excited today because I've got this Coleco Gemini, and I'm really excited to play some Moon Patrol. But unfortunately, the controller ports have a problem, so I'm going to have to open it up and fix it. So that's what I'm going to do in this episode. If you'd like to hang out and watch, I think that would be awesome. For now, let's get to work. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Coleco Gemini, basically sometime in the early 80s, the toy company Coleco was doing really well with their video game console, the ColecoVision. They had sold quite a lot, but it seems like they were still really wanting to take a real shot at Atari, specifically because Atari had such a massive library of games. I think that was a really coveted thing. It had been around for so many years at that point. The games were everywhere. And I think Coleco just thought, well, if they could play on our system, we'd sell more systems. But their problem was that the differences between the ColecoVision and the Atari 2600 were quite significant. They really weren't alike in almost any way. So it wasn't like they could just make a small adapter that would slide into the cartridge port of the ColecoVision and allow it to play 2600 games. Basically, if they wanted to make something that would work with the ColecoVision and play 2600 games, they kind of had to make their own 2600. So they did just that. You can imagine how Atari felt about it. They made a very small version of the 2600 that slotted into the expansion port on the front of the ColecoVision and basically used the ColecoVision for power and for video out. And then I guess they decided, while we're at it, why don't we just make a standalone 2600? And that's what this is. Rather cheekily named the Gemini, this is an Atari 2600 clone. But if you're interested in vintage gaming and you're just, walking through a garage sale or you're flipping through Kijiji and you see one of these, they're actually a pretty good buy. So if you want to play 2600 games, you can do it much cheaper with one of these, but there are other advantages as well. It's smaller than most of the Atari 2600 versions you might get your hands on. And not only is it smaller, it's more intelligently designed. The controller ports are on the front, which is really where they ought to be. Like it's a much smarter place for the controller ports to be. But the thing that gets people most excited about this system is the controllers themselves. They're really, really well thought out. They're very precise. When I'm playing a game that I require a lot of precision, I use the Coleco Gemini controllers. They're really, really exact, I find. That's my opinion, but I think they're really, really precise as far as joysticks go. And then, in a stroke of brilliance, Coleco put a paddle right into the base of the joystick. So if you want to change from, say, Moon Patrol to, I don't know, Super Breakout, you don't have to unplug and plug in something else that you're storing somewhere. You can just use the same controller. It's brilliant. So yes, the system has problems, not very well soldered. It did try to compete on price, so they were cutting corners all over the place when they made these things. But if you can find one that works, it's kind of a good way to get into vintage gaming because it's so cheap, it's so small, it plays all the 2600 games. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the RF output on this thing is pretty clean. So for those of you who are uninitiated, most video game systems from this era connected to a TV through what was called an RF connection, which basically means the console transmitted a signal to channels 2 or 3 or whatever you select on your television set through the port in the back where your cable would normally have come in. It's convenient for consumers because it's video and audio all in one, but the quality of the video and the audio is sometimes a little bit suspect, particularly with Atari 2600s, I find. Every Atari 2600 I have ever owned has had really poor RF connection with a television set, but this system has a bit of a reputation for being at least a little better in that department. It does have a very clean RF signal, and when I was testing this, I saw a really clean signal going through to the RF port on my modern day television. The picture looked pretty good. So if you're just trying to get into vintage gaming and you're like, dude, I don't want to mod something. I don't like soldering. I don't want to, take a thing apart and put new connections in the back of it just so I can connect it to my modern day television. This might be the thing for you, as long as your modern day television has something to connect it to. So if that has your interest, I'm gonna try to fix it. The problem with this particular console is a very common problem with this system on the whole. And that's to say, for some reason, Coleco, both with their ColecoVision and with the Gemini system, barely connected the controller ports to anything inside. It's really just like a couple of solder connections and a little plastic clasp And that's sort of it. So when you're plugging in and unplugging controllers, you can loosen the joystick port to the point that it just stops working. And that seems to be what's happened with this one. You can move left to right with joystick port number 1, but you can't fire. And joystick port number 2 is similarly not working very well. So my gut says this is a pretty easy fix. So let's get down to it. First thing, you got to take out the screws. There's 6 screws that hold the top to the bottom. It's pretty easy to take those out. One thing to note with the screws in this particular system, there's a short part of the body and a fat part of the body. Strangely, the short screws go into the fat part and the long screws go into the short part. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. They're just basic Phillips screws. They come out, 6 of them. Then I flip it over and I take the top off and I'm faced with the RF shield. It pops off pretty easily, a couple little tabs that you just sort of pull back, off comes the shield. And you can really see the problems with this particular joystick port. It really moves when I move it with my fingers. And that's a sign that it's not secured properly in there, and probably the soldered connections in there have become a little weak. This system is notorious for having really poorly soldered connections. And probably all that's required is I'm going to reflow those and they're going to work. So in order to get to those, I have to get to the underside of the board, which means I have to remove the board from the bottom housing. And to do that is just a question of removing these 7 screws. They're short screws, they hold it in place, again Phillips screws. And then flipping the board over, you can see what Coleco's intention was. You see this little plastic tab shimmying around in there. That's sort of the anchor for the joystick port, or at least the only one Coleco gave it. That lack of mechanical connection is likely the problem here. But just to make sure, I'm checking the continuity here. I've got my multimeter out. I'm just checking the connection here between the end of each pin in the joystick port. Right back to the board, just to make sure there's no nasty cracks or gaps or breaks inside the plug. Each one seems to check out here. So that means the plug is fine, and I can see all the traces look pretty good. So that means the likely culprit is probably where these pins connect to the board. And as you can see, the solder points there, they're pretty weak looking. So, while I can't see any obvious holes, I bet if I just reflow that solder, this thing's coming back to life. So that's what I do. I'm not a real master at this, but reflowing is pretty easy. Basically, I'm just heating up the connection between the pin and the board, using a little bit of new solder to get the old solder to sort of flow again a little bit better, and beefing up the connection. If I was better at this, if I was a better solderer, these new connections would have sort of a volcano shape. That's sort of what you always want to go for. That's a really good sign that you've really properly adhered something to the board. In this case, they're a little bit fat. The form is a little off, but it seems to work just fine. I haven't bridged anything here. That means I haven't joined any pins to one another that shouldn't be joined electrically. They're all separate, all 9 of them, on both port 1 and port 2. They're both looking pretty good. And as you can see, just by resoldering those points, I have made this joystick port considerably more robust. It's barely moving now, whereas before it was shimmying all over the place. And when you think about it, I have secured 9 points. So of course, it's a lot more secure, right? But also, of course, I have to be careful here because right now, every time I plug a joystick in or unplug a joystick, all of that force is going to be going on those 9 points. I need all of those 9 points to stay intact if the port's going to work. And since it's already proven to be a kind of crummy design that can break, I got to figure out some way to mechanically secure this. You'll see different kinds of ideas about how to do that. Obviously, Coleco intended for this little clip here to be the mechanical connection between the joystick port and the board. It just doesn't work very well. Like it's loose in there. If you can remember back to when this was totally loose, that part moved a lot in that hole. So I think what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of hot glue. It doesn't conduct electricity. It's reasonably safe on a board. And in this case particularly, it's not going to get anywhere near a ton of electronics. It's really just going to help secure that little plastic tab to the board. So I figure if I get the hot glue hot enough, it'll sort of seep in and around, and I will only have to put it in this point. Yes, I could add hot glue to the sides. I could add something to the top. I'm going to start by just doing this. It might not work. I'm not entirely sure about this, but it's a pretty easy repair. So if I do end up having this problem in the future a second time, I'll know that I need to secure it at more than one point. But I'm a real fan of doing as little as possible. Since the solder itself did such a good job of solidifying the port, I feel like it doesn't need a ton of help. So I'm just going to add a little bit of hot glue here and see how it goes. I'll put it on both ports. And then if there's like flux kicking around that looks ugly, I'll just give it a little bit of cleaning with some isopropyl. And now for the test. I think you can guess it worked. As you can see, the joystick works really great. Left, right, up, down, jump, no problem. The button works fine. Testing it out here with Super Breakout, I get a really good reaction from the game as I turn the paddle controller. I feel like I could play this for quite a while. My skill set says otherwise. But at least I have the will and now the controller to do that. So now, Moon Patrol. Oh, it's so good. It feels so good to fix something and then be able to play with it. I'm so happy this works. It's not rotting in somebody's basement or garage. It's not ending up in landfill. It's working and it's fun. So there you go. That's what I did this week. I hope you found that interesting, or maybe it helped you out. That would be awesome. If it did, please feel free to like or subscribe. Liking and subscribing can really help a channel. If you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. And hey, even if you don't do that, feel free to leave a comment. Do you have a Coleco Gemini, an Atari 2600, or some other vintage game console? Have you repaired it? They're all getting pretty old. I bet there's a lot of good repair stories out there. So if that's you, I want to hear about it. Please leave that story in the comments section below. And otherwise, take care, stay safe, have fun with your DIY projects, and I'll see you next Saturday.